Hi everybody, welcome to a very quick video tutorial that's going to link ideas about upstream and downstream health determinants with ideas about charity and justice, which tend to be ways that we respond to those determinants of health. So just by way of refreshing your memory, here is this neat slide that Dr. Robertson James showed us last week, helping us to differentiate between upstream determinants of health and downstream. Here's our upstream determinants and downstream determinants of health. So in response to that question as to whether or not your zip code or your genetic code is a stronger determinant of health, both the deepest well, our conversation with Miss Vicky, and comments that Dr. Robertson James has been making all semester suggest that it's actually our zip code, our living conditions, that really have the biggest impact on our health. Even though we tend to spend a lot of time focusing on individual choices and individual behaviors as being big determinants of health, in actuality, it is our living conditions. It's what's going on in our zip codes that make such an impact. And Dr. Robertson James helped us or reminded us that the reason that our zip codes are so important in determining our health is because the zip codes are where we live and where we work, are the places that we interact both with institutions and with social systems and social values that end up impacting what goes on in our zip codes, so that we know that there are social inequities that are determined by class and that by race, by immigration status, by sexual orientation, that get filtered through some of the institutions that people interact with, whether that's employment, whether that's education, whether that's healthcare, and all of those things really impact our living conditions, which then in turn shape or determine a lot of our health choices. So a place where we can start to see some overlap in terms of thinking about how to respond to these things is when we start to recognize that when there are fractures or when there are ruptures in our living conditions that are created by these social inequities or institutional inequities, there are two general ways, at least in the world of faith-based organizations, that we can tend to respond. And we can respond with what is sometimes called the 2 feet of social action, or the 2 feet of love in action. And one foot is the foot of social justice, and the other is the foot of charity. And we need both of these, but each attends to different aspects of that upstream and downstream continuum. So if we start to look, for example, and focus on upstream determinants, justice is the work of going upstream and looking at institutions and looking at systems and looking at structures to get at the root causes of why we might have certain populations of people at risk for certain diseases, or why certain populations based on a zip code, for example, would have higher rates of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So justice is the foot of social response or social action that asks why. Why are things the way they are? What is going on? And justice then wants to create structural or systemic or institutional change in these areas. So for example, really wants to work hard at asking questions about access to healthcare, wanting to ask questions about access to education, wants to ask what's going on and why does our transportation system, for example, or our recreation system in a city like Philadelphia not serve everyone equally or the way they need to be served. So justice ultimately asks why, and justice works at the upstream end of our continuum. On the other end of the continuum, the downstream side, that's where charity comes into play and is really important, because we know that these ruptures in this living conditions, fractures in people's living conditions, do create immediate need. And so charity is about addressing the symptoms, the manifestations, the things that we can physically see, either in communities or in people, that are indicators of social inequities or inequities in institutions. And so charity really wants to, charity, rather than asking why, asks questions about how can we go about best meeting immediate need, recognizing that this work, this justice work, can actually take a lot of time. This is long, arduous, long, in it for the long haul, in it for the long game kind of work. Whereas charity, on the other hand, is going to really want to try to meet immediate need. We know that we have hungry people right now in our country because of coronavirus. We know that there are people who immediately need to be tested. We know that there are children who are in schools that don't have good, clean water, right? We need to address and mitigate all of those problems right now. But if we only did that work, coming back to that other parable that Dr. Robertson James shared with us, we'd only be pulling babies out of a river. We wouldn't be going upstream and saying, listen, let's make sure that babies aren't ending up, people aren't ending up in this river to begin with, right? So justice is about going upstream and asking why. Charity is working downstream and asking how can we meet immediate need. The thing that I think is important is that we need both of them, because both justice and charity are about addressing living conditions in communities, which we know determine health. And when we focus on this area of living conditions here, this place in the middle, the place where we know there can be either fracture or flow, another really big concept comes into play, and that's the concept of the common good. And the common good, quite frankly, or simply, is the social conditions that are necessary for living a flourishing life in community. Think back to what Miss Vicki said about living your best life. The common good are the goods, the social goods that we need in order to live our best life. So we can see some of them right here in this column from our chart. Transportation, housing, whether or not our environment is clean and we have access to clean air and clean water. Stuff about employment, things about healthcare and education. Many of the living conditions that we know give rise to people being able to live a flourishing life are things that are connected to the common good. I think it's very interesting to note that our LaSalle mission places an emphasis on the common good, recognizes that your education is really something that is equipping you not only to live a good life, but to live a life that commits to that common good, commits to ensuring that people have the kinds of conditions that they need to live a flourishing life, right? So there in our mission statement, LaSalle, and affirming the value of both liberal arts and professional studies prepares students for the lifelong pursuit and exploration of wisdom, knowledge, and faith that lead to engaged and fulfilling lives marked by a commitment to the common good. So the common good is a really big idea for us here at LaSalle. So as a faith-based organization, LaSalle is very much concerned about this notion here in the middle, the hinge, the living conditions, the hinge between the upstream determinants and the downstream determinants. And we have examples of both of the 2 feet of social action on our campus. So on the charity side, which I think many of you might already be familiar with some of the ways that LaSalle attempts to meet immediate need, here are a whole bunch of just a few examples of the way in which LaSalle students and faculty and staff are attempting to figure out how we can best meet the needs of folks who are being negatively impacted by the living conditions in our city. But we also have examples of LaSalle doing justice work. In our history, I think we could see that impulse behind the Campus Boulevard Corporation in the late 70s and early 80s was very much about wanting to improve the living conditions, some of the structures and the institutions in Belfield. Currently, we could look at something like the LaSalle Votes Initiative, which is really attempting to say, hey, we create real meaningful structural change in every election cycle, so wanting to make sure folks are engaged in that. And Empower University is students who are engaged in community organizing initiatives. So the point being that these 2 feet of social action are very much alive on campus, and our invitation to you in the coming weeks will be to figure out how you might get involved. Are you interested in doing upstream justice work? Are you interested in doing some of the downstream immediate need charity work? Again, we need both. Okay, thanks for your attention.